Thanks for tuning in. I'm making some comments about an Atheist Experience call. It went out on Sunday. We had Jimmy Jr. and Christy Powell hosting, and Christian called in. He was calling in for a discussion on the reliability of the gospel. So I just want to make a few comments about this. I've already posted on my community tab some thoughts, and I'm in a discussion with one or two people. I found this a very disappointing call in terms of the way that it was dealt with. So it started off with Christian asking the hosts why they find the Gospels unreliable. Now, I'd just like to say, I'm not a great fan of people shifting the burden of proof. And in my opinion, it's not up to me to say why I find the Gospels unreliable, because I'm not claiming anything. I'm not holding up the Gospels as anything at all. They don't mean anything to me. It's believers, it's people who are supporting the Gospels as reliable. It's for them to say why the Gospels are reliable, and then it's for me to respond. So straight away, straight off the bat, I thought the hosts should have pointed out that he's shifting the burden of proof. He's the one that considers the Gospels reliable. My position would be, let's start from a blank slate. Let's say I don't know anything about the Gospels. Yeah, I'm not claiming anything. I don't know what the Gospels are. I know that they're in the Bible. What are the Gospels claiming, and why should I believe that's true? Why do you find it reliable? You convince me. So it's for the believer to convince the non-believer that the Gospels are reliable and worth believing in. It's not for me to make a case for why the Gospels are unreliable. I could make that case, but I don't see why I should. I don't see why I should fall into the trap of a Christian shifting the burden of proof. So this explains in a large part why the call developed into such a mess, because they went down a route of the initial reaction. You know, why is it unreliable? What's his name? Christie said, because it's got contradictions and because there are fantastic claims in it. This then led to 10 minutes of Christian explaining the contradictions, saying, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that the things in there are untrue. And he explained why, 4 different documents reporting on the same events could get certain things wrong or leave certain things out, and these are not necessarily contradictions, etc., etc. So he spent 10 minutes on that rather than explaining what is his really strong case for why we should believe in the claims of the Gospels. What makes them reliable? What makes the Gospels reliable? And they didn't put him on the spot about that at all. So he was left to more or less ramble and ride roughshod over them. But to make matters worse, after the lecture on the contradictions, he then came back and said, "Well, you didn't really tell me what your standard is. What are you not seeing in the text which would make you think it is reliable?" Now, this was a missed opportunity. They could have said, "Well, it's not what's in the text. What's in the text is the claims. What's missing for us is what's outside of the text, corroboration for those claims." Well, they completely missed that, and they went down another road. And Jimmy Jr. said, because Christian asked him, how are you approaching the Gospels? And he said, well, I'm approaching it as a collection of human error. Christian then laughed. He said, oh boy, yeah, what a mess this call turned into. And he ended up saying, your conclusion is in your premise. You realize that, don't you? You realize that you made a basic logical error there. You're coming to the Gospels already excluding them, discounting them as true. You're already assuming that they're in error, when what you should be doing is coming to them, assessing them, and then asking the question, is any of this true? And then going looking for evidence. So he was begging the question, and then they got bogged down in that, and it just turned into one great big mess, all because they allowed him to shift the burden of proof at the beginning, when it was up to him to explain and justify why the Gospels and the claims in the Gospels can be considered reliable and can be considered true. And then when he presented his reasons, for example, he might have said, well, we've got extra biblical evidence. We've got Tacitus, we've got Josephus, we've got Pliny the Younger. And then if they really knew their history, they could then debunk that. Well, Tacitus was just reporting that there are Christians and this is what they believed. He didn't confirm that a resurrection actually happened. Pliny the Younger, he was writing to the emperor asking, what shall I do with these Christians? These Christians believe this, that, and the other. What shall I do with them? And there's no corroboration for the resurrection or the miracles in any documents outside of the New Testament. So it all went wrong. I don't know if you saw it. Oh yes, and then there was this thing about, after he made this statement that the New Testament is a collection of human error, and then Christian pointed out, well, you're begging the question. That's and then what's his name? Christie said, well, what we mean is it's not the inerrant word of God. Okay, well, I mean, the Gospels could, if the Gospels could be corroborated, them having contradictions and not being the inerrant word of God, we could accept that. There are contradictions. It's not the inerrant word of God, but that does not necessarily mean that a lot of the events reported in the Gospels are not true. And there might well be, despite it not being the inerrant word of God, and despite the fact that there are contradictions, it might be possible to corroborate some of the events in the Gospels. So the reason that we don't believe in the resurrection, the reason we don't believe in the miracles, is not because the Gospels are not the inerrant word of God. We don't believe in them because there's no corroboration outside of the Gospels that would lead us to believe that these things actually happened. So I thought that was a bit of a red herring. It's not really relevant. And to be fair, Christian said, well, nobody's claiming, or at least I'm not claiming, and he said that a lot of Christians accept that the Bible is not the inerrant word of God. But that doesn't mean to say that a lot of the events in the Old and New Testament can't be demonstrated to have actually happened. So he's absolutely right about that. Yeah, so that's about it really. My main gripe was that about the whole thing is that A, they allowed him to shift the burden of proof, and B, they missed out a lot of things. They did make some good points, but they didn't really flesh them out properly and confront them with this big problem that there's no corroboration outside of the Gospels for the claims, and that's why we don't believe in it. But it's that he shifted the burden of proof and they let him get away with it. That's my big problem with the whole thing. Okay, let me know what you thought. Did you see the call? Were you as frustrated as I was? I looked through the comments. There were several people that said they didn't handle it well, and they said all the things that they thought that the hosts should have said, but they just didn't. Bye for now.